429, chapters 38 and 39 of the Count of Monte Cristo. Book talk begins at 9:10.
Welcome to Craftlit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 429, As You Wish. This episode of Craftlit is brought to you by Plum Deluxe Teas. Steep, savor, make moments matter. Handcrafted teas infused with love can be delivered to your doorstep each month. Find out more at plumdeluxe.com/tea. This episode is also courtesy of the generous patrons at patreon.com/craftlit. Annotated audiobooks couldn't happen without you. Thank you. Well, hello. How are you? I am starting to recover from not sleeping for the entire time I was gone, both in the podcast convention and then again in Dallas when I was there for our training. It was just whirlwind, nonstop stoppiness. But it was all good, and I learned several things that might be of interest to you. The first is that International Podcast Day is September 30th. What does that mean to you? That means several things. One is you'll probably be seeing a bunch of stuff about it online if you are online that day. The second thing is you, as a listener of a podcast, are in a rather rarefied group. Less than 30% of the population in the United States listens to podcasts, and it's even fewer in countries outside of the United States. That means you're way more than special. It means you're an ambassador for podcasts. And I'm not actually being goofy or silly or facetious about this. I really mean it, because I met people at this podcast convention who had such interesting niches. You know, Craftlet's kind of easy. Do you love classic fiction, or did you want to know classic fiction because maybe you never read it before? And are you busy? If so, Craftlit provides you what you need. There are far nichier niches than that. But these people are so enthusiastic about what they've learned and what they know, and they just want to share that with people. And it's really wonderful to get to meet people who are so positive and upbeat and enthusiastic about the stuff that they love and who know a lot so they can share it. And for those of us who are, like most Craftlit listeners, relentlessly curious, it's kind of special to get to talk to people who know things that you have no knowledge about, none, nada, zilch, zippo. So as a podcast listener, you probably know how to use the Craftlit app. You know how to use iTunes. You may know how to use Stitcher or one of the many podcast aggregator apps out there. Share that information. If you're at a Starbucks and you're sitting there with your laptop, put a little Post-it note on the backside of your laptop screen that says, I can help you find whatever podcast you might be looking for. Even if you didn't know you were looking for a podcast, trust me, you were. Or you can wear a t-shirt. Because you may have seen, if you watch any of the Craftlit Crafty Chats, you may have already seen me wearing a t-shirt that on the front has the Craftlit logo and says PSBS. And on the back it says, podcasting since before serial. Well, even if you haven't been podcasting since before serial, there's a good chance you've been podcast listening since before serial. And I have at our little Zazzle store a very similar t-shirt, Craftlit logo, PLSBS, podcast listener since before serial. If you want to advertise your awesome podcast knowledge, you can pick one of those up and wear it on September 30th and know what it feels like to be a podcaster and have people walking up going, what is that? What's a podcast? How does that work? Huh. I've never heard of that before. Because I'm serious, I still get, I've never heard of that before. Also, if you live outside the United States and haven't yet, please consider leaving a review for Craftlit at the iTunes store in your country. They are actually tracking between now and September 30th all of the non-United States generated podcast reviews because they're trying to get a feel for how international podcasts are. We know that the numbers aren't as big as the United States ratio-wise, but that doesn't mean that they're not important and growing outside of the United States as well. So if you have 4 minutes and you don't mind heading over to iTunes and leaving a review, that would be awesome. And of course, if you're in the United States and haven't left a review yet, please feel free to do so as well. You don't have to write much more than yay or or whatever, but leaving a review is sure a big help. Thank you. So Craftlit is very excited to have a sponsor this week, Plum Deluxe Teas. So I know a lot of you are tea drinkers. I know I am a tea drinker, and you know I am a tea drinker, and we've talked about tea before. But I was so excited when Andy contacted me about a sponsorship because Plum Deluxe Tea does a Tea of the Month subscription. Now, he sent me several packets to try, and holy cow, this tea is fantastic. The amount of flavor, you know how when you do a wine tasting, if you have somebody who's really good at explaining it to you, you can taste all these different tastes on your tongue? Yeah, that's what this tea was like. So for $10 a month, you can receive freshly hand-blended, all organic, loose-leaf teas that are made just for the club. But that's not the only thing they do. They have more than just this mailing list. They also have a real club, because the club members have access to all sorts of other goodies. It's kind of like Ravelry for tea drinkers. There are online discussion groups, there are meetups, there are tea swaps. There's this really wonderful community that is built into the Tea of the Month Club. So if you are interested in getting yourself some really, really fantastic tea and also getting an opportunity to meet even more really fantastic people online, take yourself over to plumdeluxe.com/tea and learn more. So Crafty Chat this week was just me, so there's not much of a conversation for me to play for you, but I will do a better job recording here than I do there. So I am going to share with you one of the things that I shared on the YouTube live stream this week, which is that when I went to the podcasting conference, I met a guy who runs a YouTube podcast, so it's a video cast, called dadsews, S-E-W-S. Christopher is not someone who you would stereotype as a sewer. However, he was a stand-up comic. He now hosts several podcasts. Dad Sews is one of them, and the tag on the bottom of it is "So, fail, repeat," which just made me feel better somehow. But he also has Plaid Dad Blog, which is also a YouTube channel and a blog. And at whatarewewatching.com, he has a video podcast with his, I think, 10-year-old son about dissecting and reviewing children's television. And they're an interesting crew, and he's an interesting guy. And if you've seen the movie Office Space and you like the fax machine scene, go watch the very first episode of Dad Sews. And the last bit of it, the last chunk of it, is a shot-for-shot remake of the fax scene with the music, but done with the sewing machine. You'll see why if you see the first episode. I hope to have him on at some point and share some of what he's doing and why he's doing it and why he started and wanted to sew in the first place. Not that I think it's so mysterious why anyone would want to learn how to sew and use a sewing machine, but just I think it's kind of cool and not something people talk about out in the world very often for men. And I think it'd be a good idea to get some of that chat out. So, yay. So, the Count of Monte Cristo. This week I wanted to start off with some voicemail feedback from Brenda, our mail lady, who had this comment to say about the last episode.
Hi, Heather. This is Brenda, the mail lady, and I just finished listening to the latest episode, which is very interesting. And I just had a few comments because it was just such a great chapter. But first of all, Luigi Vampa reminds me in a weird way of Wesley from The Princess Bride, because they both started out as farm boys. They're both really intelligent, they're brave, they're funny. I don't know about Luigi Vampa, but anyway, and they just kind of fall into this position in which they're captains of a band of pirates or or bandits or whatever. But yes, they're respectful, and I don't know, maybe the guy that wrote Princess Bride got his idea from that I just keep picturing Wesley. Also, then St. Sebastian, thank you for explaining about him. I knew that he was the pincushion guy, but I didn't really know his story, so that was really interesting. I had no idea that it went back to Roman times. Appreciated that explanation. And then the catacombs, I kept thinking about Indiana Jones when he goes down in the catacombs in the third movie, so that kind of is a picture of what those little niches in the wall look like. But also, did you know that there are kind of catacomb-type tunnels underneath Paris? They mined under Paris to get the chalk or whatever they used for what became known as plaster of Paris. So there are all these tunnels under there. And then, I don't know exactly what century it was, but talk about layers of generations. Their cemeteries were so layered and full and unhygienic and just a mess that at one point they decided to dig up all the cemeteries and reinter the bones down in these catacombs. And you can go through tours of them today. So maybe some of you guys, when you go to Paris, can go down in those catacombs. I haven't been, but someday maybe I will. And then the last thing I wanted to mention, the Sistine Chapel on the back wall, I think haven't been there either, but the mural is of the Last Judgment. And just a little funny story. I read once that Michelangelo, when he painted that, and it has all this torment of the souls that will be going to hell and the others that will be saved are happy. But apparently he painted some of the people he didn't like and some of his enemies in these torturous positions and kind of, hey, if you're the painter, you can do what you want, I guess. So just a little funny there. And thanks for all you do. I love to learn new stuff. So this episode was just chock full, and I thank you so much. And I hope you had a good trip to and from Dallas, and keep doing great work. Love your podcast, and have a great week. Bye.
This is why I love you, because when I don't remember things, you do. And then you call and you share them, or you post comments on the show website, and thank you. One of those comments came from Carolyn, who said, I think Julius Caesar probably wrote in Latin. Yeah, epic fail on that one. The other thing was the shudder. I've gotten some emails and some comments, and some people think that the Count shuddered when he shook Albert's hand last week because it was the son of the product of Mercedes and Fernand, and it just unnerved him, or maybe even disgusted him, to have physical contact with this person, which makes you think, wow, if he's having that kind of reaction, how is he able to be this nice to him the whole time, as far as just his attitude goes? But then Susan wrote in and said, isn't it interesting how differently we can see things? I didn't read the Count's shudder as one of revulsion at all. I thought it was more from a sensation of awareness or familiarity, perhaps, to Mercedes, or maybe to himself at that age, a confident / callow young man. Well, we get a little bit more Albert today, and it's interesting. The how much doesn't change in 100 and way too many years. Because there are things describing Albert, things that Dumas says about him that I thought, wow, I know kids today who would fit that description so perfectly. So I'm very interested to see what you think about Albert's living quarters. What? I hear you say, but we've already seen his living quarters. He's here in Rome, and we've been in the hotel with them this whole time. And yes, but today we go back to France. Not for very long, admittedly, but we are going to go back to France. Now, today I'm playing you two chapters 38 and 39, and I don't want to stall very much. Most of the things that I wrote down as notes are actually not all that important or difficult. There's a lot of colloquial things that kind of fly by that were popular or au courant at the time, but they really don't have any necessarily historical resonance to them. So I decided probably don't need those things. But the way that one particular statement is phrased at the beginning of this, the Victorian free public domain translation, it makes it sound like the Count is expecting to get paid back by Albert and Franz. That is not true. And that is not how it is explained in the retranslation. And this happened so early on in the chapter, I just didn't want it to throw you because it really threw me when I was listening. I kept going, wow, why would the Count do that? Because he sounds so cavalier, like, oh, yeah, no, it's just this. And it's, oh, it's not the big deal. It's just, I saved you this much money instead of, and you owe me this much money because I went in and got you from Luigi Vampa. So it is not a debt situation. The only debt is Albert's debt to the Count for rescuing him, not financial. Albert will say, bring me one of my mother's liqueurs salorettes. This is a liquor cabinet, like a portable liquor cabinet, and that's all. It's just fancy talk for something like that. And those of you who are listening to War of the Worlds with me on the premium feed, you know, we've been talking several times over previous chapters about how many wars there were during the 1800s in Europe. Today you will hear references to tensions between Spain and Don Carlos in Spain and France. And it's just more of these kinds of skirmishes. And the only other thing I thought before we listen that might be of use is a Prix Montyon. This was a medal or an award that you could get from the French government, a branch of the French government, for particularly valiant actions. And so that'll show up at the end of 38. And then 39 is a completely different kettle of fish. If I say any more, I'm going to spoil stuff. So just keep your ears open. Once chapter 39 begins, keep your ears open for some characters' names. There are going to be new characters, definitely track them, but other people who you've heard of before are going to start to pop up. And that's true for the next several chapters too. So keep your ears open. I'll catch you on the flip side and we'll talk about what you heard. Here we go with chapters 38 and 39 of The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandré Dumas.
Chapter 38, The Compact. The first words that Albert uttered to his friend on the following morning contained a request that Franz would accompany him on a visit to the Count. True, the young man had warmly and energetically thanked the Count on the previous evening, but services such as he had rendered could never be too often acknowledged. Franz, who seemed attracted by some invisible influence towards the Count, in which terror was strangely mingled, felt an extreme reluctance to permit his friend to be exposed alone to the singular fascination that this mysterious personage seemed to exercise over him, and therefore made no objection to Albert's request, but at once accompanied him to the desired spot, and after a short delay the Count joined them in the salon. "My dear Count," said Albert, advancing to meet him, "permit me to repeat the poor thanks I offered last night, and to assure you that the remembrance of all I owe to you will never be effaced from my memory. Believe me, as long as I live, I shall never cease to dwell with grateful recollection on the prompt and important service you rendered me, and also to remember that to you I am indebted even for my life." "My dear, very good friend, and excellent neighbour," replied the Count with a smile, "you really exaggerate my trifling exertions. You owe me nothing but some trifle of 20,000 francs, which you have been saved out of your travelling expenses, so that there is not much of a score between us. But you must really permit me to congratulate you on the ease and unconcern with which you resigned yourself to your fate, and the perfect indifference you manifested as to the turn events might take." "Upon my word," said Albert, "I deserve no credit for what I could not help, namely a determination to take everything as I found it, and to let those bandits see that although men get into troublesome scrapes all over the world, there is no nation but the French that can smile, even in the face of grim death itself. All that, however, has nothing to do with my obligations to you, and I now come to ask you whether, in my own person, my family, or connections, I can in any way serve you. My father, the Comte de Morcerf, although of Spanish origin, possesses considerable influence both at the court of France and Madrid, and I unhesitatingly place the best services of myself and all to whom my life is dear at your disposal." "Monsieur de Morcerf," replied the Count, "your offer, far from surprising me, is precisely what I expected from you, and I accept it in the same spirit of hearty sincerity with which it is made. Nay, I will go still further, and say that I had previously made up my mind to ask a great favour at your hands." "Oh, pray name it." "I am wholly a stranger to Paris. It is a city I have never yet seen." "Is it possible," exclaimed Albert, "that you have reached your present age without visiting the finest capital in the world? I can scarcely credit it." "Nevertheless, it is quite true. Still, I agree with you in thinking that my present ignorance of the first city in Europe is a reproach to me in every way, and calls for immediate correction. But in all probability I should have performed so important, so necessary a duty as that of making myself acquainted with the wonders and beauties of your justly celebrated capital, had I known any person who would have introduced me into the fashionable world. But unfortunately I possessed no acquaintance there, and of necessity was compelled to abandon the idea." "So distinguished an individual as yourself," cried Albert, "could scarcely have required an introduction." "You are most kind, but as regards myself, I can find no merit I possess, save that as a millionaire I might have become a partner in the speculations of Monsieur Aguado and Monsieur Rothschild. But as my motive in travelling to your capital would not have been for the pleasure of dabbling in stocks, I stayed away till some favourable chance should present itself of carrying my wish into execution. Your offer, however, smooths all difficulties, and I have only to ask you, my dear Monsieur de Morcerf," these words were accompanied by a most peculiar smile, "whether you undertake upon my arrival in France to open to me the doors of that fashionable world, of which I know no more than a Huron or a native of Cochin China." "Oh, that I do, and with infinite pleasure," answered Albert, "and so much the more readily as a letter received this morning from my father summons me to Paris in consequence of a treaty of marriage. My dear Franz, do not smile, I beg of you. With a family of high standing and connected with the very cream of Parisian society." "Connected by marriage, you mean?" said Franz laughingly. "Well, never mind how it is," answered Albert. "It comes to the same thing in the end. Perhaps by the time you return to Paris I shall be quite a sober, staid father of a family. A most edifying representative I shall make of all the domestic virtues, don't you think so? But as regards your wish to visit our fine city, my dear Count, I can only say that you may command me and mine to any extent you please." "Then it is settled," said the Count, "and I give you my solemn assurance that I only waited an opportunity like the present to realize the plans that I have long meditated." Franz did not doubt that these plans were the same concerning which the Count had dropped a few words in the grotto of Monte Cristo, and while the Count was speaking the young man watched him closely, hoping to read something of his purpose in his face. But his countenance was inscrutable, especially when, as in the present case, it was veiled in a sphinx-like smile. "But tell me now, Count," exclaimed Albert, delighted at the idea of having to chaperone so distinguished a person as Monte Cristo, "tell me truly whether you are in earnest, or if this project of visiting Paris is merely one of the chimerical and uncertain air castles of which we make so many in the course of our lives, but which, like a house built on the sand, is liable to be blown over by the first puff of wind." "I pledge you my honour," returned the Count, "that I mean to do as I have said. Both inclination and positive necessity compel me to visit Paris." "When do you propose going thither?" "Have you made up your mind when you shall be there yourself?" "Certainly. In a fortnight or 3 weeks' time, that is to say, as fast as I can get there." "Nay," said the Count, "I will give you 3 months ere I join you. You see I make an ample allowance for all delays and difficulties." "And in 3 months' time," said Albert, "you will be at my house?" "Shall we make a positive appointment for a particular day and hour?" inquired the Count. "Only let me warn you that I am proverbial for my punctilious exactitude in keeping my engagements." "Day by day, hour for hour," said Albert. "That will suit me to a dot." "So be it, then," replied the Count, and extending his hand towards a calendar suspended near the chimney-piece, he said, "To-day is the 21st of February," and, drawing out his watch, added, "It is exactly 10:30. And now promise me to remember this, and expect me the 21st of May, at the same hour in the forenoon." "Capital!" exclaimed Albert. "Your breakfast shall be waiting." "Where do you live?" "Numero 27, Rue de Helder." "Have you bachelor's apartments there? I hope my coming will not put you to any inconvenience." "I reside in my father's house, but occupy a pavilion at the farther side of the courtyard, entirely separated from the main building." "Quite sufficient," replied the Count, as taking out his tablets he wrote down No. 27, Rue de Helder, 21st May, 10:30 in the morning. "Now then," said the Count, returning his tablets to his pocket, "make yourself perfectly easy. The hand of your timepiece will not be more accurate in marking the time than myself." "Shall I see you again ere my departure?" asked Albert. "That depends. When do you leave?" "To-morrow evening at 5 o'clock." "In that case I must say adieu to you, as I am compelled to go to Naples, and shall not return hither before Saturday evening or Sunday morning. And you, Baron?" pursued the Count, addressing Franz. "Do you also depart to-morrow?" "Yes." "For France?" "No, for Venice. I shall remain in Italy for another year or 2. "Then we shall not meet in Paris?" "I fear I shall not have the honour." "Well, since we must depart," said the Count, holding out a hand to each of the young men, "allow me to wish you both a safe and pleasant journey." It was the first time the hand of Franz had come in contact with that of the mysterious individual before him, and unconsciously he shuddered at its touch, for it felt cold and icy as that of a corpse. "Let us understand each other," said Albert. "It is agreed, is it not, that you are to be at numero 27 in the Rue du Helder on the 21st of May at 10:30 in the morning, and your word of honour passed for your punctuality?" "The 21st of May, at 10:30 in the morning, Rue du Helder, number 27," replied the Count. The young men then rose, and bowing to the Count, quitted the room. "What is the matter?" asked Albert of Franz, when they had returned to their own apartments. "You seem more than commonly thoughtful." "I will confess to you, Albert," replied Franz, "the Count is a very singular person, and the appointment you have made to meet him in Paris fills me with 1,000 apprehensions." "My dear fellow," exclaimed Albert, "what can there possibly be in that to excite uneasiness? Why, you must have lost your senses." "Whether I am in my senses or not," answered Franz, "that is the way I feel." "Listen to me, Franz," said Albert. "I am glad that the occasion has presented itself for saying this to you, for I have noticed how cold you are in your bearing towards the Count, while he, on the other hand, has always been courtesy itself to us. Have you anything particular against him?" "Possibly." "Did you ever meet him previously to coming hither?" "I have." "And where?"
Will you promise me not to repeat a single word of what I am about to tell you?"
"I promise." "Upon your honour?" "Upon my honour." "Then listen to me." Franz then related to his friend the history of his excursion to the island of Monte Cristo, and of his finding a party of smugglers there, and the 2 Corsican bandits with them. He dwelt with considerable force and energy on the almost magical hospitality he had received from the Count, and the magnificence of his entertainment in the grotto of the 1001 Nights. He recounted with circumstantial exactitude all the particulars of the supper, the hashish, the statues, the dream, and how at his awakening there remained no proof or trace of all these events, save the small yacht seen in the distant horizon, driving under full sail toward Porto Vecchio. Then he detailed the conversation overheard by him at the Colosseum between the Count and Vampa, in which the Count had promised to obtain the release of the bandit Peppino, an engagement which, as our readers are aware, he most faithfully fulfilled. At last he arrived at the adventure of the preceding night, and the embarrassment in which he found himself placed by not having sufficient cash by 600 or 700 piastres to make up the sum required, and finally of his application to the Count and the picturesque and satisfactory result that followed. Albert listened with the most profound attention. "Well," said he, when Franz had concluded, "what do you find to object to in all you have related? The Count is fond of travelling, and being rich, possesses a vessel of his own. Go but to Portsmouth or Southampton, and you will find the harbours crowded with the yachts belonging to such of the English as can afford the expense, and have the same liking for this amusement. Now, by way of having a resting place during his excursions, avoiding the wretched cookery which has been trying its best to poison me during the last 4 months, while you have manfully resisted its effects for as many years, and obtaining a bed on which it is possible to slumber, Monte Cristo has furnished for himself a temporary abode where you first found him, but, to prevent the possibility of the Tuscan government taking a fancy to his enchanted palace, and thereby depriving him of the advantages naturally expected from so large an outlay of capital, he has wisely enough purchased the island, and taken its name. Just ask yourself, my good fellow, whether there are not many persons of our acquaintance who assume the names of lands and properties they never in their lives were masters of." "But," said Franz, "the Corsican bandits that were among the crew of his vessel?" "Why, really the thing seems to me simple enough. Nobody knows better than yourself that the bandits of Corsica are not rogues or thieves, but purely and simple fugitives, driven by some sinister motive from their native town or village, and that their fellowship involves no disgrace or stigma. For my own part, I protest that should I ever go to Corsica, my first visit, ere even I presented myself to the mayor or prefect, should be to the bandits of Colomba, if I could only manage to find them, for on my conscience they are a race of men I admire greatly." "Still," persisted Franz, "I suppose you will allow that such men as Vampa and his band are regular villains, who have no other motive than plunder when they seize your person. How do you explain the influence the Count evidently possessed over those ruffians?" "My good friend, as in all probability I owe my present safety to that influence, it would ill become me to search too closely into its source. Therefore, instead of condemning him for his intimacy with outlaws, you must give me leave to excuse any little irregularity there may be in such a connection, not altogether for preserving my life, for my own idea was that it never was in much danger, but certainly for saving me 4,000 piastres, which being translated means neither more nor less than 24,000 livres of our money, a sum at which most assuredly I should never have been estimated in France, proving most indisputably," added Albert with a laugh, "that no prophet is honoured in his own country." "Talking of countries," replied Franz, "of what country is the Count? What is his native tongue? Whence does he derive his immense fortune, and what were those events of his early life, a life as marvellous as unknown, that have tinctured his succeeding years with so dark and gloomy a misanthropy? Certainly, these are questions that in your place I should like to have answered." "My dear Franz," replied Albert, "when upon receipt of my letter you found the necessity of asking the Count's assistance, you promptly went to him, saying, 'My friend Albert de Morcerf is in danger. Help me to deliver him.' Was not that nearly what you said?" "It was." "Well, then, did he ask you, 'Who is Monsieur Albert de Morcerf? How does he come by his name, his fortune? What are his means of existence? What is his birthplace? Of what country is he a native?' Tell me, did he put all these questions to you?" "I confess he asked me none." "No, he merely came and freed me from the hands of Signor Vampa, where I can assure you, in spite of all my outward appearance of ease and unconcern, I did not very particularly care to remain. Now then, Franz, when for services so promptly and unhesitatingly rendered, he but asks me in return to do for him what is done daily for any Russian prince or Italian nobleman who may pass through Paris, merely to introduce him into society, would you have me refuse? My good fellow, you must have lost your senses to think it possible I could act with such cold-blooded policy." And this time it must be confessed that, contrary to the usual state of affairs in discussions between the young men, the effective arguments were all on Albert's side. "Well," said Franz with a sigh, "do as you please, my dear Viscount, for your arguments are beyond my powers of refutation. Still, in spite of all, you must admit that this Count of Monte Cristo is a most singular personage." "He is a philanthropist," answered the other, "and no doubt his motive in visiting Paris is to compete for the Montyon prize, given, as you are aware, to whoever shall be proved to have most materially advanced the interests of virtue and humanity. If my vote and interest can obtain it for him, I will readily give him the one and promise the other. And now, my dear Franz, let us talk of something else. Come, shall we take our luncheon, and then pay a last visit to St. Peter's?" Franz silently assented, and the following afternoon, at 5:30, the young men parted. Albert de Morcerf to return to Paris, and Franz d'Épinay to pass a fortnight at Venice. But ere he entered his travelling carriage, Albert, fearing that his expected guest might forget the engagement he had entered into, placed in the care of a waiter at the hotel a card to be delivered to the Count of Monte Cristo, on which, beneath the name of Vicomte Albert de Morcerf, he had written in pencil, 27 Rue du Helder, on the 21st of May, 10:30 a.m. End of chapter 38. Chapter 39. The Guests. In the house in the Rue du Helder, where Albert had invited the Count of Monte Cristo, everything was being prepared on the morning of the 21st of May to do honour to the occasion. Albert de Morcerf inhabited a pavilion situated at the corner of a large court, and directly opposite another building, in which were the servants' apartments. 2 windows only of the pavilion faced the street. 3 other windows looked into the court, and 2 at the back into the garden. Between the court and the garden, built in the heavy style of the imperial architecture, was the large and fashionable dwelling of the Count and Countess of Morcerf. A high wall surrounded the whole of the hotel, surmounted at intervals by vases filled with flowers, and broken in the centre by a large gate of gilded iron, which served as the carriage entrance. A small door, close to the lodge of the concierge, gave ingress and egress to the servants and masters when they were on foot. It was easy to discover that the delicate care of a mother unwilling to part from her son, and yet aware that a young man of the Viscount's age required the full exercise of his liberty, had chosen this habitation for Albert. There were not lacking, however, evidences of what we may call the intelligent egoism of a youth who is charmed with the indolent, careless life of an only son, and who lives, as it were, in a gilded cage. By means of the 2 windows looking into the street, Albert could see all that passed. The sight of what is going on is necessary to young men, who always want to see the world traverse their horizon, even if that horizon is only a public thoroughfare. Then, should anything appear to merit a more minute examination, Albert de Morcerf could follow up his researches by means of a small gate, similar to that close to the concierge's door, and which merits a particular description. It was a little entrance that seemed never to have been opened since the house was built, so entirely was it covered with dust and dirt, but the well-oiled hinges and the locks told quite another story. This door was a mockery to the concierge, from whose vigilance and jurisdiction it was free, and like that famous portal in the Arabian Nights, opening at the sesame of Ali Baba, it was wont to swing backward at a cabalistic word or a concerted tap from without from the sweetest voices or whitest fingers in the world. At the end of a long corridor, with which the door communicated and which formed the antechamber, was on the right Albert's breakfast-room, looking into the court, and on the left the salon looking into the garden. Shrubs and creeping plants covered the windows and hid from the garden and court these two apartments, the only rooms into which, as they were on the ground floor, the prying eyes of the curious could penetrate. On the floor above were similar rooms, with the addition of a third formed out of the antechamber. These three rooms were a salon, a boudoir, and a bedroom. The salon downstairs was only an Algerian divan for the use of smokers. The boudoir upstairs communicated with the bedchamber by an invisible door on the staircase. It was evident that every precaution had been taken. Above this floor was a large atelier, which had been increased in size by pulling down the partitions, a pandemonium in which the artist and the dandy strove for preeminence. There were collected and piled up all Albert's successive caprices, hunting horns, bass viols, flutes, a whole orchestra, for Albert had had not a taste but a fancy for music, easels, palettes, brushes, pencils, for music had been succeeded by painting, foils, boxing gloves, broadswords, and single-sticks, for, following the example of the fashionable young men of the time, Albert de Morcerf cultivated, with far more perseverance than music and drawing, the three arts that complete a dandy's education, i.e., fencing, boxing, and single-stick. And it was here that he received Grisier, Cook, and Charles Leboucher. The rest of the furniture of this privileged apartment consisted of old cabinets, filled with Chinese porcelain and Japanese vases, Luca della Robbia Faviense, and Palissy platters of old armchairs, in which perhaps had sat Henri IV or Sully, Louis XIII or Richelieu, for two of these armchairs, adorned with a carved shield, on which were engraved the fleur-de-lis of France on an azure field, evidently came from the Louvre, or at least some royal residence. Over these dark and sombre chairs were thrown splendid stuffs, dyed beneath Persia's sun, or woven by the fingers of the women of Calcutta or of Chandanaga. What these stuffs did there, it was impossible to say. They awaited, while gratifying the eyes, a destination unknown to their owner himself. In the meantime, they filled the place with their golden and silky reflections. In the centre of the room was a Roller and Blanchet baby grand piano in rosewood, but holding the potentialities of an orchestra in its narrow and sonorous cavity, and groaning beneath the weight of the chefs-d'œuvre of Beethoven, Weber, Mozart, Haydn, Grétry, and Popora. On the walls, over the doors, on the ceiling, were swords, daggers, Malay creeses, maces, battle-axes, gilded damasked and inlaid suits of armour, dried plants, minerals, and stuffed birds, their flame-coloured wings outspread in motionless flight, and their beaks forever open. This was Albert's favourite lounging place. However, the morning of the appointment, the young man had established himself in the small salon downstairs. There, on a table, surrounded at some distance by a large and luxurious divan, every species of tobacco known, from the yellow tobacco of Petersburg to the black of Sinai, and so on along the scale from Maryland and Puerto Rico to Latakia, was exposed in pots of crackled earthenware, of which the Dutch are so fond. Beside them, in boxes of fragrant wood, were ranged, according to their size and quality, pueros, regalias, Havanas, and Manillas, and in an open cabinet a collection of German pipes, of chibouks, with their amber mouthpieces ornamented with coral, and of narghils, with their long tubes of Morocco, awaiting the caprice or the sympathy of the smokers. Albert had himself presided at the arrangement, or rather the symmetrical derangement, which, after coffee, the guests at a breakfast of modern days love to contemplate through the vapour that escapes from their mouths and ascends in long and fanciful wreaths to the ceiling. At 10:15, a valet entered. He composed with a little groom named John, and who only spoke English, all Albert's establishment, although the cook of the hotel was always at his service, and on great occasions the Count's chasseur also. This valet, whose name was Germain, and who enjoyed the entire confidence of his young master, held in one hand a number of papers, and in the other a packet of letters, which he gave to Albert. Albert glanced carelessly at the different missives, selected 2 written in a small and delicate hand, and enclosed in scented envelopes, opened them and perused their contents with some attention. "How did these letters come?" said he. "One by the post. Madame Danglars' footman left the other." "Let Madame Danglars know that I accept the place she offers me in her box. Wait. Then, during the day, tell Rosa that when I leave the opera I will sup with her as she wishes. Take her 6 bottles of different wine, Cyprus, sherry, and Malaga, and a barrel of Ostend oysters. Get them at Borel's, and be sure you say they are from me." "At what o'clock, sir, do you breakfast?" "What time is it now?" 10:15. "Very well. At 10:30. Debray will perhaps be obliged to go to the minister, and besides—" Albert looked at his tablets. "It is the hour I told the Count, 21st of May, at 10:30, and though I do not much rely upon his promise, I wish to be punctual. Is the Countess up yet?" "If you wish, I will inquire." "Yes, ask her for one of her liqueur cellaret. Mine is incomplete, and tell her I shall have the honour of seeing her about 3 o'clock, and that I request permission to introduce someone to her." The valet left the room. Albert threw himself on the divan, tore off the cover of 2 or 3 of the papers, looked at the theatre announcements, made a face, seeing they gave an opera and not a ballet, hunted vainly amongst the advertisements for a new tooth-powder of which he had heard, and threw down, one after the other, the 3 leading papers of Paris, muttering, "These papers become more and more stupid every day." A moment after, a carriage stopped before the door, and the servant announced Monsieur Lucien Debray. A tall young man with light hair, clear grey eyes, and thin and compressed lips, dressed in a blue coat with beautifully carved gold buttons, a white neckcloth, and a tortoise-shell eyeglass suspended by a silken thread, and which by an effort of superciliary and zygomatic muscles he fixed in his eye, entered with a half-official air, without smiling or speaking. "Good morning, Lucien." "Good morning," said Albert. "Your punctuality really alarms me." "What do I say? Punctuality. You whom I expected last, you arrive at 5 minutes to 10, when the time fixed was 30:30. Has the ministry resigned?" "No, my dear fellow," returned the young man, seating himself on the divan. "Reassure yourself. We are tottering always, but we never fall, and I begin to believe that we shall pass into a state of immobility, and then the affairs of the peninsula will completely consolidate us." "True. You drive Don Carlos out of Spain." "No, no, my dear fellow. Do not confound our plans. We take him to the other side of the French frontier, and offer him hospitality at Bourges." "At Bourges?" "Yes, he has not much to complain of. Bourges is the capital of Charles VII. Do you not know that all Paris knew it yesterday, and the day before it had already transpired on the Bourse, and Monsieur Danglars, I do not know by what means that man contrives to obtain intelligence as soon as we do, made 1 million. And you another order, for I see you have a blue ribbon at your buttonhole." "Yes, they sent me the order of Charles III," returned Debray carelessly. "Come, do not affect indifference, but confess you were pleased to have it." "Oh, it is very well as a finish to the toilet. It looks very neat on a black coat buttoned up." "And makes you resemble the Prince of Wales or the Duke of Reichstadt."
"It is for that reason you see me so early."
Because you have the order of Charles III, and you wish to announce the good news to me?
No, because I passed the night writing letters, 25 dispatch. I returned home at daybreak and strove to sleep, but my head ached, and I got up to have a ride for an hour. At the Bois du Boulogne, ennui and hunger attacked me at once. Two enemies who rarely accompany each other, and who are yet leagued against me, a sort of Carlo-Republican alliance. I then recollected you gave a breakfast this morning, and here I am. I am hungry. Feed me. I am bored. Amuse me.
It is my duty as your host, returned Albert, ringing the bell, while Lucien turned over with his gold-mounted cane the papers that lay on the table. Germain, a glass of sherry and a biscuit. In the meantime, my dear Lucien, here are cigars, contraband, of course. Try them and persuade the minister to sell us such instead of poisoning us with cabbage leaves.
Peste! I will do nothing of the kind. The moment they come from gouvernement, you would find them execrable. Besides, that does not concern the home, but the financial department. Address yourself to Monsieur Human, section of the indirect contributions, corridor A, numero 26.
On my word, said Albert, you astonish me by the extent of your knowledge. Take a cigar.
Really, my dear Albert, replied Lucien, lighting a manila and a rose-coloured taper that burnt in a beautifully enamelled stand. How happy you are to have nothing to do. You do not know your own good fortune.
And what would you do, my dear diplomatist, replied Morcerf, with a slight degree of irony in his voice, if you did nothing? What? Private secretary to a minister? Plunged at once into European cabals and Parisian intrigue? Having kings and, better still, queens to protect, parties to unite, elections to direct, making more use of your cabinet with your pen and your telegraph than Napoleon did of his battlefields with his sword and his victories, possessing 25,000 francs a year besides your place, a horse for which Chateau Renaud offered you 400 louis, and which you would not part with, a tailor who never disappoints you, with the opera, the jockey club, and other diversions. Can you not amuse yourself? Well, I will amuse you.
How?
By introducing you to a new acquaintance.
A man or a woman?
A man.
I know so many men already.
But you do not know this man.
Where does he come from? The end of the world?
Farther still, perhaps.
The deuce! I hope he does not bring our breakfast with him.
Oh, no. Our breakfast comes from my father's kitchen. Are you hungry?
Humiliating as such a confession is, I am. But I dined at Monsieur de Villefort's, and lawyers always give you very bad dinners. You would think they felt some remorse. Did you ever remark that?
Ah, depreciate other persons' dinners. You ministers give such splendid ones.
Yes, but we do not invite people of fashion. If we were not forced to entertain a parcel of country boobies because they think and vote with us, we should never dream of dining at home, I assure you.
Well, take another glass of sherry and another biscuit.
Willingly. Your Spanish wine is excellent. You see, we were quite right to pacify that country.
Yes, but Don Carlos?
Well, Don Carlos will drink Bordeaux, and in 10 years we will marry his son to the little queen.
You will then obtain the golden fleece, if you are still in the ministry.
I think, Albert, you have adopted the system of feeding me on smoke this morning.
Well, you must allow it is the best thing for the stomach. But I hear Beauchamp in the next room. You can dispute together, and that will pass away the time.
About what?
About the papers.
My dear friend, said Lucien with an air of sovereign contempt, do I ever read the papers?
Then you will dispute the more.
Monsieur Beauchamp, announced the servant.
Come in, said Albert, rising and advancing to meet the young man. Here is Debray, who detests you without reading you. So he says.
He is quite right, returned Beauchamp.
for I criticize him without knowing what he does. Good day, Commander."
"Ah, you know all that already," said the private secretary, smiling and shaking hands with him.
"Pardieu."
"And what do they say of it in the world?"
"In which world? We have so many worlds in the year of grace. 1838.
"In the entire political world, of which you are one of the leaders." "They say that it is quite fair, and that sowing so much red, you ought to reap a little blue."
"Come, come, that is not bad," said Lucien.
"Why do you not join our party, my dear Beauchamp? With your talents you would make your fortune in 3 or 4 years."
"I only wait one thing before following your advice. That is, a minister who will hold office for 6 months. My dear Albert, one word, for I must give poor Lucien a respite. Do we breakfast or dine? I must go to the chamber, for our life is not an idle one." "You only breakfast. I await 2 personnes, and the instant they arrive we shall sit down to table." End of chapter 39.
I know. Madame Danglars, what? Yes. And Lucien, who is an official in the government, Lucien said that there was something about the way Danglars knew about events before they happened, or seemingly before they happened, and then would put money into the stock market betting on those things. And then lo and behold, the things came true, and Danglars cleaned up because whatever it was that he put his money into, it went up. He went up with them. He made another 1,000,000 francs. And yes, it's our Danglars. Now, there are a couple of really interesting things going on in today's 2 chapters as far as Dumas and construction of the chapters. So far, these 2, 38 and 39, are the most altered that we've come across between the Victorian translation and the newer translation by Robin Buss. Some of that is just in making the words make more sense rhythmically to our ears. Obviously, one of those places was the Count not actually saying that Albert owed him money. But there's some other interesting things that are going on here. For example, where we ended today, our end of chapter 40, is the midway point of chapter 40 in the Robin Buss translation. I think that where we ended today is a really great ending place. It's a cliffhanger. There's no explanation in the Robin Buss as to why they broke the chapter in a different place. And having been looking at how War of the Worlds has been printed and reprinted, and how H.G. Wells fiddled with stuff all the way along, to the point where it's hard to get a quote-unquote pure version of War of the Worlds, Dumas suffered some of the same problems with his reprints and translations. So that was one of the interesting things that was going on in between the French, the Victorian English, and the more modern translation. But there are a couple of other things that are going on too. For one thing, I now have, within the span of 7 days, come across 2 of my favorite lines in literature so far. In War of the Worlds, it was, "This is no time for pugilistic chivalry." And here we have the phrase, "punctilious exactitude." And I just love that. So that's one of the things that's going on in the book. But you have Lucien, who is pretty high up in government and very much a bureaucrat and very aware of the bureaucracy that surrounds French government at the time. And then you have Albert's friend Beauchamp, and he's a journalist who's covering the branch of news that Lucien is a participant in, which gives us an idea of Albert may be looking in the newspapers for not such important articles or facts and saying that the papers get stupider and stupider all the time. But his friends are interesting and they're not stupid. And so there's got to be something about this kid, right? We haven't seen a whole lot of it. And he even confesses that he was a little nervous at Luigi Vampa's. But these are really not slouches who he's hanging out with. And so the conversation about being bored and having nothing to do and working is an interesting one. But clearly these guys are all coming from, if not exactly the same class in society, they're within spit and distance, upbringing-wise. Probably the most important thing that flew by in today's chapters was Franz talking about certain words that were dropped in his ear from when he and the Count of Monte Cristo were in the grotto. And so I had to go back and figure out what words those were that Franz was talking about. And so let me play you this section.
"And like the celebrated sailor whose name you have assumed," he said, by way of changing the conversation, "you pass your life in travelling?" "Yes, I made a vow at a time when I little thought I should ever be able to accomplish it," said the unknown with a singular smile. "And I made some others also, which I hope I may fulfill in due season." Although Sinbad pronounced these words with much calmness, his eyes gave forth gleams of extraordinary ferocity. "You have suffered a great deal, sir?" said Franz inquiringly. Sinbad started and looked fixedly at him, as he replied, "What makes you suppose so?" "Everything," answered Franz. "Your voice, your look, your pallid complexion, and even the life you lead." "I live the happiest life possible, the real life of a pasha. I am king of all creation. I am pleased with one place and stay there. I get tired of it and leave it. I am free as a bird and have wings like one. My attendants obey my slightest wish. Sometimes I amuse myself by delivering some bandit or criminal from the bonds of the law. Then I have my mode of dispensing justice, silent and sure, without respite or appeal, which condemns or pardons, and which no one sees. If you had tasted my life, you would not desire any other, and would never return to the world unless you had some great project to accomplish there." "Revenge, for instance," observed Franz. The unknown fixed on the young man one of those looks which penetrate into the depth of the heart and thoughts. "And why revenge?" he asked. "Because," replied Franz, "you seem to me like a man who, persecuted by society, has a fearful account to settle with it." "Ha ha!" responded Sinbad, laughing with his singular laugh, which displayed his white and sharp teeth. "You have not guessed rightly. Such as you see me, I am, a sort of philosopher, and one day perhaps I shall go to Paris to rival Monsieur Appert and the little man in the blue cloak." "And will that be the first time you ever took that journey?" "Yes, it will. I must seem to you by no means curious, but I assure you that it is not my fault I have delayed it so long. It will happen one day or the other." "And do you propose to make this journey very shortly?" "I do not know. It depends on circumstances which depend on certain arrangements." "I should like to be there at the time you come, and I will endeavor to repay you, as far as lies in my power, for your liberal hospitality displayed to me at Monte Cristo." "I should avail myself of your offer with pleasure," replied the host. "But unfortunately, if I go there, it will be, in all probability, incognito."
I love moments like this in books where you can flip backwards through the pages, or in this case, rewind the audio, and go back and find all of the little hints, the Easter eggs that were dropped for us by an author who knew where he was going and was able to lay down some really good foreshadowing for us. In fact, when I was older and getting my teaching credential, I got so frustrated because the teachers that had taught foreshadowing to me when I was in school had approached it like it was this very important thing and you had to understand how it worked, instead of kind of flipping back through a book and saying, "Whoa, okay, so did you pick up on this? Look at this thing here. Isn't this fun? Because isn't that fun? Is it just me? Maybe it's just me. Maybe it's just us." I have a sneaking suspicion that you feel the same way I do. But that was great. right? Now, that recording that you heard was actually a clip from B.J. Harrison's version of The Count of Monte Cristo, which is available over on Audible. And those of you who listen to the premium audio, you will recognize his voice as the man who narrated Three Men in a Boat, to say nothing of the dog, for us. I actually had to play, and I mean had to, compelled to play a clip from earlier in B.J. Harrison's version of The Count of Monte Cristo, to play it for my boys, because there is one scene. Oh, it's when the three bad guys, Danglars, Caderousse, and Fernand, were all at the outdoor cafe drinking and plotting, and Mercedes and Edmond walk by. That means he had 5 voices plus the narrator that he had to do, and he did, and they were all identifiable, and I just about fell over and played it for the boys, and their jaws dropped too, because even for them, not knowing who these characters were, they could identify the different voices that were being used. B.J. Harrison's pretty amazing. Plus, he's a really nice guy. But it's important that we bring up Fernand for a minute, because we heard way back at the beginning, Albert said something about his father, and his father having a certain amount of influence in Spain, where he was born, and France, where he now is, that he performed some service that served both governments. And so he's got connections, or if you read The Great Gatsby, connections. He is important enough that Albert is at least able to say that his dad has influence. We don't know if that's true. It could just be his son being all, yeah, my dad's so cool. Either way, Fernand has raised himself to a certain height, which means hubris. This could be fun. Now, there were a couple of other sections of the text where there was a certain amount of variation between the Victorian translation and the modern Robin Buss translation. And a couple of these I'm going to read to you because they're really important. And one of them I'm just going to bring up because it's another fantastic phrase. In the newer translation, Albert's arrangement of his objet d'art in his sitting room was that it was an arrangement of systematic disorder. However, in the Victorian translation, it's symmetrical derangement, which I thought, well, that describes my whole world right there. That was awesome. I kind of prefer the Victorian one. So there was that, which was fun. But then here are some of the important ones. The first time that Lucien enters Albert's rooms, Albert says in the newer translation, "Good morning, Lucien, good morning. Ah, but you terrify me, my dear fellow, with your punctuality. What am I saying? Punctuality? I was expecting you last of all, and you arrive at 5 to 10 when the invitation was definitely fixed only at 50:30. It's a miracle. Can this mean that the government is overthrown by any chance?" And then Lucien says, "No, my dearest fellow," the young man said, planting himself on the divan. "Rest assured, we are always unsteady, but we never fall." In the Victorian translation, there was some joke using the word tortured. We are always tortured, but, and then he goes on from there. And the tortured may have conveyed the same feeling back in the 1840s. Not so much now. It sounded a little odd to me, but this translation I thought really did a nice job. Plus, Robin Buss did a great job talking about Lucien's monocle. It was the zygomatic muscle part that described how he looked. The newer version says, "Monsieur Lucien Debray, a tall young man, fair-haired, pale, with a confident gray eye and cold, thin lips, wearing a blue coat with engraved gold buttons, a white cravat, and a monocle in a tortoiseshell rim dangling from a silk cord, which, by a coordinated effort of the superciliary and zygomatic arches, he managed from time to time to secure in the cavity of his right eye. Came in without smiling or speaking, and with a semi-official bearing." And I just love the tiny little slight, the little poke in the ribs at Lucien of him managing from time to time to actually keep the thing in his eye. Because, it's important to represent, is what we say. So those were a couple of important things, and one kind of silly one. But a very, very important difference is we heard
I know so many men already. But you do not know this man? Where does he come from, the end of the world? Farther still, perhaps? The deuce! I hope he does not bring our breakfast with him. Oh, no. Our breakfast comes from my father's kitchen. Are you hungry? Humiliating as such a confession is, I am. But I dined at Monsieur de Villefort's, and lawyers always give you very bad dinners. You would think they felt some remorse. Did you ever remark that? Ah, depreciate other persons' dinners. You ministers give such splendid ones.
Or in French.
Mais vous avez donc faim? Oui, je l'avoue, si humiliant que cela soit à dire, mais j'ai dîné hier chez M. de Villefort. Et avez-vous remarqué cela, cher ami? On dîne très mal chez tous ces gens du parquet. On dirait toujours qu'ils ont des remords. Ah, pardieu, dépréciez les dîners des autres, avec cela qu'on dîne bien chez vos ministres.
While this is what the modern Robin Bust translation says. Lucien says, I'm ashamed to confess it, but I am hungry. I had dinner yesterday at the home of Baron Danglars. I don't know if you've noticed, my friend, but one always dines very poorly with these stock exchange types. It's as though they had a guilty conscience. That's kind of a big difference between Villefort and Danglars. I don't have any explanation for why the original French and the Victorian translation put that moment in the hands of Villefort. I mean, it's not a mistake in name, right? It's not just, ooh, I screwed up and put one bad guy's name down instead of the other, because the joke had to be altered from lawyer to stock exchange type. So I don't know. When you were listening to the book, you heard Villefort. Modern translation says Danglars. I actually would stick to Danglars in this instance, if only because Madame Danglars was mentioned earlier in the chapter. And then, of course, we have the lovely interplay between the right-of-center politician and the left-of-center journalist, and they get along rather well. Definitely joking with each other, making their points, but in a funny way and polite. And I thought that was pretty cool. And so that's it for this week. There's a new newsletter that went out. If you're not signed up for the newsletter, please go to the show notes at craftlit.com/429, and you'll find a little place to type your email in down in the book chat section so that you can have the new schedule at hand. Because of travel that I'm doing for work and the Paris trip, and also the beginning of the school year, which is always complicated, I'm still on kind of our modified summer schedule for the regular podcast. The premium feed will go out as usual, where I try and get at least 3 episodes out of 4 done every month. And there are a couple other goodies, especially if you are a Patreon patron or if you are a download-only subscriber for the premium audio. Keep your eyes open for a new password and a newsletter for you as well. There's some special goodies in it for you this time. And I think that's it. There are links in the show notes in the book talk section that I didn't mention here, just in case one of the things that I didn't talk about made you go, I wonder what that's about. I put all the links in just in case you wanted to take a look. And I also put some links in the Crafty Chat to other podcasts from podcasters that I met at the convention. A lot of them were business podcasters or podcasting about podcasting podcasters, but some of them weren't. And based on comments that I've seen from you in the Facebook group and elsewhere online, and also just knowing some of you for 10 years, I went ahead and put links to any of the podcasts that I thought you might be interested in. So I think that's it. Thank you so much. If you like regular doses of annotated audiobooks, please visit this episode's sponsor, Plum Deluxe Teas, at plumdeluxe.com/tea, and give yourself a treat. Start your subscription to the Tea of the Month Club. These delicious organic teas are proudly blended in Portland, Oregon, and they will never let you down. And you too can support the show at patreon.com/craftlit. Patreon perks await you, including access to the premium annotated audiobook, which is currently War of the Worlds. There are several ways to listen to the free podcast, as well as the premium book links, and easy-to-follow instructions are found at craftlit.com/listen. If you or someone you know is in need of audio support, please visit audioeditingsolutions.com. John, and especially our personal editor, Justin, are the reason why Craftlit has been able to come to you in 2016. Thank you, and thank you, patrons, for making this possible. You're the best. If you enjoyed the show, please remember, go to iTunes, subscribe, rate and review, like us on Facebook, get yourself on our mailing list, and come back to hear more annotated audiobooks. Thank you so much. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on. If you like getting free audiobooks with benefits every week, please consider supporting the show over at patreon.com/craftlit. There are rewards waiting for you beyond, the free podcast. You can also subscribe to our premium streaming audio by tapping the red lock when you are looking at the app or at the show notes at craftlit.libsyn.com/podcast. You can also sign up for a premium download subscription by following the links in the right-hand sidebar at craftlit.com. And if it's easier for you, you can always subscribe and review at iTunes and at Stitcher Radio. Like us on Facebook, support us at Patreon, and come with us on tour. For 9 years, Craftlit has been kept going by the support of you, the listener. And for that, I am truly grateful. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.